Hey everyone, I want to go ahead and explain this next assignment, Cultural Excavation and Autobiography. The purpose of this assignment is to really think about our backgrounds as teachers. Um, the very first thing you did for our class was break apart the term culturally responsive classroom management. And in thinking about what it means to be culturally responsive, many students wrote that it chiefly is about understanding your students and their cultural backgrounds and being responsive to their cultures, which, yes, absolutely, that is a critical component of being culturally responsive. Another critical component of it, however, actually begins with us being very introspective and willing to critically analyze our own cultural backgrounds. This quote by Ross Kamen and Cody sums that up really well. They say, and I'm reading right here, that culturally responsive teachers are simultaneously curious about cultures and introspective. They know that culture impacts people's perceptions, knowledge, and interactions, and that the impact of cultural assumptions is often implicit. They strive to learn more about who they are, what they believe, and how their beliefs and experiences influence their perceptions of and interactions with students and families. So, the purpose of this assignment is to do exactly that, for us to dig into what our backgrounds are, what we believe, and how our beliefs and experiences are influencing our work with students and families. The title of the assignment, Cultural Excavation, comes from, and I'm popping down here, Ladson Billings' 2017 chapter that you all read, The Revolution Will Not Be Standardized. And as you'll recall in that chapter, she goes through her three core pillars or tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy. And she says the second one is the one that's the most often misunderstood, and that one is cultural competence. And in her writing about cultural competence, she says that we, especially as teachers, need to undergo a cultural excavation. So many times, teachers who come, well, let me back up. We all know that there's a demographic divide, that the majority of teachers are white, middle class, privileged, Christian, straight, name all the privileges. And that does not represent the students who we teach. That's not, of course, totally true. We have plenty of diverse teachers. We need more. But too oftentimes, folks who come from privilege don't think that we even have culture. And that's really where Ladson Billings was talking about. There is, we need to be excavating and really digging deep to understand what our culture is. I think about just last week I was in Kansas for I don't know, several days. And I mean, just visually, I might think like, oh, I share a lot with these people. I mean, it was primarily white folks in the city where I was. Primarily looked pretty middle class. But culturally, actually, we had so many differences just in the ways that people greet each other, the foods they eat, the ways that people interact. Like, I'm pretty direct, people out in the Midwest, not so direct. So, anyways, there's a lot of cultural differences that we might take for granted. Okay, blah blah blah. I can really get off on tangents. Okay, look here. So for the purpose of this assignment, I think I've already articulated that to you. It says here in two parts. It's actually in three parts. You're going to be writing this autobiography in three different parts. And prior to reading it, you need to go back, please, and reread just those 3 pages from Gloria Ladson Billings' chapter on cultural competence. And I'd also like you to revisit the Nieto and Bode chapter on culture and learning. Both of those pieces really should inform the way that you're kind of thinking and writing about culture in this paper. All right, so part 1 is a sociocultural history. Part 2 is an educational resources analysis. And part 3 is digging deeper, and it's driving me crazy because I'm noticing I didn't format all these the same, so I'm going to reformat them. Okay. Part 1 for your sociocultural history. This should be a narrative sketch that describes your sociocultural heritage. Here you should describe your identities as they relate to these categories and any others that seem relevant. I don't expect you, I'm about to cough. Pardon me. To go through boom, 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 one at a time, every single one of these. But certainly as you're thinking about your culture and how it informs who you are and your expectations in the classroom, really start thinking about each of these and which of these are the most salient for you and your family. Um, like I'm thinking about, for example, religion and spiritual practices. I was not raised in a family that was religious, so I probably wouldn't actually even I would take that off. But many students were raised in very religious families, and the role of children and adults in power say a lot about our beliefs about how kids should interact. That's something actually Lads and Billings talked about in that chapter. So for here, you're not necessarily just going through and describing like, oh, I have parents and here were their professions, but always everything you're saying here, and how did that affect you, and how did that impact the way you think about kids. Try to always do that next step of how these different parts of your sociocultural history are shaping who you are today or who you were as a kid. That's sociocultural history. The second part is now looking at educational resources analysis. And here we want you to really think critically about what kind of access you had to various types of resources as you were growing up in the schooling system. So which resources were or were not part of your educational history, and how did that help you achieve, or how did it hinder you from achieving as much as you could have? When we talk about resources here, we're thinking of it very broadly, so not just financial, although of course we can't deny that financial resources are very impactful, but also, family's a resource in many different ways, school structures, the quality of the school system in which you're working, and I put quality here in quotes because I think that's an extremely subjective term. School structure, for example, tracking. Tracking being if you were placed in regular quote unquote classes or honors, AP, accelerated, gifted. I'm always amused, I guess, I don't know if that's the right word, when I read the educational resources analysis for my students and hear all the different terms that different school systems around the country use for the gifted program. Because if we're calling gifted, what are we saying about the other kids? Anyway, certainly thinking about culture in the classroom and whose culture was addressed and taken up, whose voices were silenced. That's an educational resource that's in many ways a hidden resource. I decided to put these questions down here instead of in the previous section, although you might have written about them in the previous section. And this is if you consider yourself to be from a historically underserved student group, and if so, how were your experiences shaped by that, and how were other students in your school treated by educators and fellow students? I actually would be interested in hearing from everyone in the class to reflect on that, whether you're from an underserved group or not. Hopefully you have some observations about underserved groups and how they were treated in your school. And then also, do you consider yourself to be from a historically privileged group? And here is thinking about unearned privileges. Privilege we have just because the families we were born into, the skins we were born into, the genders, well, not genders, sexes we were born into, etc., and what those afforded you or not. So again, you don't need to go through every single one of these topics, but please do consider the bulk of them. Here, we want you to really be thinking about issues of privilege and resources and how those affected your experiences. Okay, and then part 3, this can be much briefer than the other two. No more than a page, definitely, for this one. But this is just a conclusion on kind of like putting it all together and how your past has shaped your work now as an educator. So thinking about how your expectations now are informed by your history and cultural background. And when I say expectations, I mean for student behavior, for how kids interact with you, for your expectations for how families might interact with you, parents, things such as that. And then what work do you still have to do in unpacking your own past and in developing your cultural competence for yourself and students? So that is that. Altogether, this should only be about 4 to 5 4 to 5 double-spaced pages. There's some formatting information in the syllabus. Please submit this as a Word file. That will allow us to go in and do track changes. Blah, blah, blah. For this paper, you do not need to do all the cover page, running head, APA stuff. If you do reference any readings that we've done already, then do use APA style, but other than that, you don't need to do that. And the very last thing is to let you know that that your paper will be shared with the class. So one of the reading assignments coming up will be to read each other's and look broadly across the sort of themes we're noticing and such. If you would prefer to not have the class read the paper you submit, then submit two versions, one that is for me to read and one that's for the class to read. I completely understand that if there are details you prefer not everybody read. All right. Please let me know if you have any questions about this, and really looking forward to reading what you write.